by Ethan Henry. So, thesis statement. I would argue that by creating a more modern day scenario in the relationship between Tartuffe and Orgon makes it easily accessible and relatable for contemporary audiences while still keeping the satirical edge of the original production. In choosing Act 2, Scenes 2 to 4 for this adaptation, we developed a scenario in which Tartuffe was recast as a TV evangelist, aka televangelist, who has conned Orgon. This characterization allows us to amplify the original themes of hypocrisy, confirmation bias, and sheer unwillingness to listen that was depicted in the play, all within a reimagined construct. By magnifying these persistent societal problems, we are able to parallel the relationships between 17th century hypocrisy with that of its modern descendant. Production history. So, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, also known as Molière, created the first production of Tartuffe in 1664, but the production was considered extremely controversial and was banned by the king amongst other authorities. Many critics of Molière's original production of Tartuffe insisted that the play was an attack on religion, but Molière rightly maintained that he was attacking hypocrisy and not religion. Crawford states, "The whole action of the play itself makes it abundantly clear that Molière is against extremes, that he is satirizing not faith, but blind faith, the same irrational, unseeing faith that still generates problems today." End quote. During this time, Molière also famously wrote an appeal to the king on behalf of his banned play. He stated, "The purpose of comedy is to correct the faults of men." He further argued that the moral necessity of the play and was determined to get it back on the stage. In 1667, he rewrote and retitled it as The Impostor. Unfortunately, that play was also immediately banned by Paris authorities. But finally, on February 5th, 1669, with help from the king, Molière's Tartuffe as we know it opened at the Palais Royal with Molière himself playing the role of Orgon. Production history, political and social commentary. So, during the 5 years after his first production ban in 1664, Molière began solving the problem of including critical views of politics and society into the structure of the play. After refusing to concede to the religious and royal authorities, the strategy he developed was transforming theater into a, and I quote, self-conscious instrument of ironic political and social commentary. In Tartuffe, Molière used the established conventions that were imposed on him by the authoritarian system of politics and manners as a way to criticize the system itself. With this play, Molière tests the limits of what may be mounted on the 17th century stage, and he identifies Louis XIV, the then current king of France, as the ultimate source of what might be allowed to be performed on the stage and in the world. This play thus becomes an exploration to the extent of which all performance, theatrical, moral, social, and political, is dependent upon the king's power to censor. Spengler states, "Tartuffe may be read and staged as Molière's critique of the king's performance in a performed world. In other words, a critique ironically disguised as a conventional flattery of the monarchy." So this brings me into my next point, talking about televangelism. So televangelism is defined as religious programs that are usually run on television or radio. The programs are hosted almost always by Protestant ministers who conduct various religious services and often ask for frequent donations by their followers. Televangelism has had a long and glorious history throughout the United States. The practice has been studded with sexual scandals, financial corruption, and countless lawsuits for perpetrating fraud and deception. Despite its obvious corruption, it continues to thrive and has grown into an entire branch of broadcasting known as the prosperity gospel, and its production value rivals that of major networks. On top of these scandals, the Protestant ministers are often called out for their blatant hypocrisy, especially with the way they choose to spend their money that they receive from their followers. Many of them own several multi-million-dollar mansions and incredibly expensive private jets as well. But how exactly does this relate back to Tartuffe? Well, similar to the followers who devote much of their time and money to these televangelists, despite the hypocrisies and blatant deceptions, Orgon exhibits the same quote-unquote blind faith and devotion to Tartuffe, despite his obvious corruption. He undisputably trusts whatever Tartuffe says, regardless of the countless reprimands from his family. This leads many of us to a consideration of a major dramatic question of this play, which is, why does Orgon worship and flatter Tartuffe? Why does this wealthy, seemingly good-off man force his entire family to accept the presence of the supposedly pious Tartuffe? One explanation for this, as Crawford states, as Tartuffe so dramatically amplifies, once blind faith has entered the scene, it becomes a weakness of character to waver and strength of character to persist, even in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. In fact, strong evidence to the contrary is usually translated by the mind as temptation, and that the true believer would rather die than yield. End quote. Another explanation is argued by Carduyo. He states, Orgon continued to serve Louis XIV with a wise and loyal heart, both by installing what he believed to be a genuine quote-unquote director of conscience in his home in order to ensure its conformity to the Catholic doctrine and thus to avoid the charge of Protestant heresy, infidelity, or religious incorrectness. By mimicking the king's political absolutism with a kind of domestic absolutism in which Orgon plays the role of a comic bourgeoisie Louis XIV, with Tartuffe as his chief minister. Conclusion. So, despite the era that Tartuffe was written, Molière tapped into persisting relevance of hypocrisy, confirmation bias, and rejection of truth within the greater society. Despite any scholarly examination or deeper understanding of those issues, this 17th century play perfectly captured the universal need to have one's biases confirmed and beliefs nurtured despite any and all evidence to the contrary. He tapped into hierarchical religious establishments steeped in both hypocrisy and contradiction, and was able to illuminate those behind the clever facade of satire. Not only are these fallacies still relevant today, but are even more amplified in our modern society as a result of social media. The seeming suspension of thoughtful discourse and analytical rigor in order just to feel good about your beliefs and biases persist, despite living in this so-called more enlightened era. And Molière was able to cleverly disguise his criticisms of the church in their manipulative ways behind his humor and satirical subterfuge. Tartuffe became a proxy for his criticism of the establishment church and yielded brilliant, still relevant results. Thank you guys for watching. So right here is my works cited. And yeah, thanks for watching.